Hello everyone, and welcome to our online worship. It's the 7th of November, or All Saints Sunday. There's lots of tears in our narrative today. Jesus is weeping, his friend Mary is weeping at his feet, Martha, the sister is weeping, all the friends who gather around Lazarus' grave. Yes, life is full of loss. And Martha says something to Jesus that I think is not that unusual for people who trust God. Why didn't you do something to prevent this? Why didn't you do something? Why do you allow these things to happen? And Jesus has an answer for her, but it's not what we would expect. A reading from the Gospel of John. The reading today is from John chapter 11, beginning at verse 32. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit, deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, there is already a stench because he's been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Lots of tears in this passage today. Lots of weeping. We have Jesus weeping. We have his best friends, Mary and Martha, weeping. We have Lazarus' friends weeping. So, it's an unusual text. There's no doubt about it. And it's the account of the raising up of Lazarus. And this is one of these passages that if you read at home, you might think that, I don't know what this means. I don't know what this means for me. I don't know how I can connect to this in any way. Because basically what happens here is that Jesus' best friend, Lazarus, actually was friends with the family. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were his closest companions. Kind of like his family away from his own family. And this is an account of the day that Lazarus died. And the once dead Lazarus, as Jesus stands outside the tomb, calls him out. He comes stumbling out of the tomb, wrapped up like a mummy, and he is basically revived. And there he is in his grave clothes. Yeah, what a kind of a strange, unusual sight. And it might be one of these passages that you would skip over it if you were reading it at home. But again, as we've seen, we know this from experience. We know that with every passage there is going to be multiple layers that we can relate to if we take our time and we look into it a little bit more. Maybe there's going to be many characters in the story, and maybe we'll relate to one or two or three of them. We're going to see Jesus, of course. We're going to see Jesus weeping at the at the tomb, at the grave. And some of you might relate to that. You might say, yes, you know what? If Jesus is grieving, I can completely relate to that, because I think I'm going through a lot of grief in my life. You'll see in this passage, Martha, certainly a woman of great faith, but completely bewildered by Jesus' actions in this passage. So if you're a person of faith but you're going through something and you're feeling like, I just don't know where God is, I don't know what in the world God's doing, you might relate to Martha in this passage. Or the disciples. The disciples, again, they're like, why does he take so long to do things? You know, why is he doing what he's doing? They're bewildered too. And Mary, she's another one. She just weeps at his feet. So lots of grief in this one. But here's the story. And I have to give you some meanings to the words, because it really opens up the passage to you. Do you know the name? Remember, the whole thing is written in New Testament Greek. The name Lazarus means God helps. And the town that he lives in is Bethany, which means the house of affliction. And we're told also that Jesus loved Lazarus, right? So right away at the beginning of the story, the storyteller, who is John, very poetic, mystical kind of writer, is telling you a story about someone that God helps who lives in the house of affliction. So, I mean, he's setting you up to tell you a story about someone who is in the house of affliction. Now, you'll know, John, of course, is a mystic, and he cannot talk about Jesus without using metaphors. He's not a straightforward writer. He speaks about Jesus as the living water and the bread of life and, you know, the light of the world. And he likes to use that kind of language when he gives his account of things. So, tell you right at the beginning of this, you'll want to get in touch with the Lazarus in you in order to fully appreciate the impact of this story, of this narrative. Because, you know, Lazarus is the one in the story that is in an absolutely hopeless, beyond help position, or at least it feels that way to everyone on the outside. So the story, this is the very, very brief version. There's a much longer version in John, it's 45 verses. But the brief version is, Jesus is with his disciples. He's 2 days away from this town called Bethany, 2 days walk. And he's with his disciples, and he hears that his best friend Lazarus is really sick. And he just hangs around for 2 days. He doesn't do anything. In fact, the old King James version has, the Lord tarried, which is an old word that means basically Jesus stays put. He doesn't do anything. After 2 days, he tells his disciples, okay, let's go. We're going to go to Bethany. We're journeying there, and we're going to see Lazarus because he's died. So it's a long journey on foot, and they get there, and Martha, Lazarus' sister, runs out to him and says, Jesus, if you had been here, this would never have happened. In other words, he's dead. It's too late. He's gone. He's buried. He's in the grave. And Jesus has this curious line. He says, he'll rise again at the resurrection. Well, she knows that. She believes in the resurrection. The ancient Jews of 2,000 years ago believed that after people died, there would be a future event, that there would be some sort of raising up to life. Now, how they understood that and what that looked like isn't clear, but they had an idea, as we do, actually, that the end isn't really the end, that there is something else. Even if we're not clear about it, we have a sense that because of the promises of Jesus, that the end isn't the end. So she says, yeah, I know at the resurrection he'll be fine. And Jesus said, he came back and he said, no, he said, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, later on, the other sister Mary comes, she's grieving. She just kneels at his feet and weeps. He goes back to Lazarus' house, all the friends are there, they're all weeping. They go to the grave of Lazarus. Remember, he's been buried for several days now. And he calls for the stone to be removed from the front of the cave. Remember, they were always buried in caves. So he calls for the stone to be removed. Everybody's shocked, everybody's horrified because he's been in there for 4 days. And the stone is removed. And they're even more shocked when Lazarus comes stumbling out of this dark tomb, wrapped up in his grave cloths, and alive. Now, if that reminds you of the Easter account, which it should, if you know the Easter story, if that reminds you of the Easter account, I think that's very deliberate on the writer's part, on John's part, because for John, this is the very last sign or the very last miracle that Jesus does before his death and before his resurrection. So it's deliberately placed here because it's almost like he's given us a little hint of what is going to come. Just a little smidgen of a hint. So from John's creative perspective, he's saying now, pay attention. Because not only is this going to happen to Lazarus, or this happened to Lazarus, this will happen to Jesus, and this will happen to you. Now, in some ways, Lazarus wasn't resurrected. He was more like he was revived because he actually went on, had a life, and then he died, right? For Jesus, his resurrection was quite different. For Jesus, he died, he was resurrected, and he is alive. There is no more death. So Lazarus isn't quite a resurrection in the same way, but we call it the resurrection of Lazarus. So one of the things, of course, is, when the grave is filled, this is why this passage is so common at funerals. When the grave is filled up, when the body is buried, when the breath leaves the body, this is all pointing to it's not the end of the story. Now, it's certainly the end of a chapter. I don't want to make light of death in any way here because death is real and it is brutal and it is heartbreaking and there's no way to soften the blow. And Scripture doesn't necessarily soften the blow. What the Scripture does is that it says it doesn't get the final word. It doesn't get the last word, which is why this passage is so popular at funerals. But I mentioned earlier that, let me apply this to us, a couple of things we can think about. I mentioned earlier that there's going to be someone in this narrative, in this story, that you would resonate with. And I mentioned that there were a number of ways that you could go with this. There is, for example, Jesus standing weeping at the grave, which is an interesting thing to consider, that Jesus was and did grieve on the earth, that is a part of the human experience, that grieving and mourning and sadness is all a part of life and faith. Right? There's nothing not spiritual about grieving. The disciples, kind of bewildered, wondering, why did he wait there 2 days? Well, he said it was to the glory of God, but still, why does he do what he does? We don't really understand why he's so slow at times. Is there purpose in all this waiting? Well, if you're waiting for something, that might be an encouragement to you. that there is always purpose in waiting with God, that God's timing is always perfect and never late, always. Even though to our minds, when we look at things and when we look at timing, it can look terrible for us. Maybe you're like Mary, you just feel like weeping at his feet because it's so hopeless. Whatever you're going through, whatever is, maybe it's not you that's going through it, maybe you're watching someone go through something. You just feel like, I don't know, it's hopeless. You're just weeping at his feet. There are lots of tears in this story, isn't there? And then there's Martha, such a curious mix of anger and grief and trust and faith, which is actually so complex and so like us. This is the way it is in our spiritual lives. It's complex. It's often many things. In other words, you can have faith, and which I'm talking, when I say faith, I mean trust. I mean, ultimately you're trusting in God. I think that you can have trust, and I think you can have anger, and I think you can have disappointment all on the same day. Strange as that sounds. This is the thing that jumped out at me, this reading. When Jesus gets to Bethany, the house of affliction, as John likes to call it, when he gets there, she scolds him, Martha. In other words, she's like, this could have been avoided, but you didn't come here. So there's this sense that she's frustrated with him. There's a sense that you could have prevented it. You could do something. I've seen you do things in the past. I've seen you raise people up and do all sorts of signs and miracles, and yet you tarried, yet you waited, and now it's too late. If you hadn't delayed, you could have done something. Why didn't you do something? Not that she's going to get an answer to that, right? As we won't either. But I think that is something that we can relate to sometimes, that sort of bewilderment. Oh, I really don't understand you, and I really don't understand this world. I think it's a very common reaction when we suffer. I think it's a common reaction for grief and mourning. There's a part of grief and mourning that is just bewildering. It's like a friend of mine says quite often, whose idea is this anyway? As she looks out at the world. Whose idea is this? In other words, this is crazy. The whole cycle of life, circle of life, don't talk to me about it. It's crazy. Who set it up this way? Birth and death and suffering, and well, the birth part's okay, right? We all like the birth. We all like the new birth. It's the stuff in between that is distressing to us. So I think when Martha says, if you had been here, I hear a weariness there. Now I could be reading into it, but I hear a weariness in her voice. And I think many of us can relate to that. There's certain things that make us weary. And Jesus reminds her, he says, Lazarus will rise again. She says, yeah, I know, got it. I know, all about resurrection, got it. But then, this is what he does that's really quite fascinating. He doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop there and say, I know he's going to, be okay in the end and be resurrected. He steers her to a more immediate sense of God's activity. And he says to her, Martha, you're missing the point. I am the resurrection and the life. Right here, right now, right at this moment, not when you die, not when you go to heaven, or not when you're resurrected at some point in time. No, he's saying, it's much bigger than that. I am the resurrection and the life. It's almost like she's thinking that, I know that God can help me and God will help me, but it's always up in the future somewhere. And I think we can do that. That yes, I have trust in God. And yes, I know God's real. And yes, I know God can do all sorts of things. But it's always somewhere up in the future. Hasn't quite happened right at this moment and happened yet. And Jesus draws her to the very present moment and says, no, I'm the resurrection and the life right now. You can trust it. I'm here for you right now, right at this moment. I am the life. It was one of Jesus' names, I am resurrection, I am life. And when he uses that word life, because he says that this is the purpose he came. He said, the purpose I came as is that so you would have life and have it abundantly. He's talking about a quality of life here and now that we can experience. This isn't pie in the sky by and by. This isn't so much, oh, in the end, when all is said and done, everything will work out okay, which actually I believe will happen, because I think that's what redemption is all about. But he's drawing her to right this moment, and I think that that's one of the lessons for us today, that we have to sort of seize God in the moment and take what we have right at this moment in time, rather than always thinking it's up ahead or it's out there. Jesus is saying it's not always about out there. It's right now I'm with you, and right now I'm life for you. So there's the prayer. There's the heart cry, that God would make that real to us, that Emmanuel is with us, walking with us, the Spirit dwelling in us right at this moment in time. Amen.
All these pieces broken, scattered, mercy gathered, mended and whole, empty-handed, but not forsaken. I've been redeemed, I've been set free. Was